History as it happens, March 18th, 2021. The messy marriage of America and Saudi Arabia.
As long as I am president, the government of the United States will continue throughout the world to enhance human rights.
Jimmy Carter vowed to make America the lead promoter of human rights in international affairs, but in the decades since, the U.S. has kept close to countries with abysmal human rights records. Today, the U.S. Saudi marriage is under scrutiny again as activists pressure President Biden to punish the Crown Prince for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Human rights and realpolitik. Next, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Political killings, tortures, arbitrary and prolonged detention without trial or without a charge. These are the cruelest and the ugliest of human rights violations.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Let's start by asking a couple of questions that may sound naive to some of you. Can the United States really claim to support democracy and freedom while also backing dictators and kings? What's more important, human rights or oil? These and other questions have hung over the U.S. Saudi relationship since FDR became the first president to meet a Saudi Arabian king in 1945. Yes, the world's a complicated place. Moral absolutes often lose out to realpolitik. That's a system of politics or principles based on practical rather than moral or ideological considerations. And we're being forced to face those considerations again in light of the determination by U.S. intelligence that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman personally approved the murder of dissident journalist Jamal Khashoggi. He was a resident of Virginia whose crime was to criticize the Saudi leadership.
If you believe these people have done wrong, the first thing you can do is be transparent and honest about what we think they have done. And we've done that. The Biden administration, to its credit, made public our intelligence assessment and essentially called them out.
That's Philip Zelikow. He was the executive director of the 9/11 Commission, and he's an expert on diplomacy, serving in 5 different presidential administrations. Our conversation with him is coming up in a moment. First, let's briefly review how both Presidents Trump and Biden dealt with the Khashoggi murder. Trump decided not to punish the Crown Prince or end U.S. support for Saudi Arabia's calamitous war in Yemen, and he was pretty honest about why. The relationship was too important.
If we abandoned Saudi Arabia, it would be a terrible mistake. They're buying hundreds of billions of dollars worth of things from this country. If I say we don't want to take your business, if I say we're going to cut it off, they will get the equipment, military equipment and other things from Russia and China.
If you look at Saudi Arabia, they're an ally and they're a tremendous purchaser of not only military equipment, but other things. When I went there, they committed to purchase $450 billion worth of things and $110 billion worth of military.
When running for president against Trump, then candidate Biden promised he would come down hard on the Saudis. And as you'll hear in this clip from one of the Democratic primary debates, he vowed to make human rights a priority in foreign affairs.
The CIA has concluded that the leader of Saudi Arabia directed the murder of U.S.-based journalist Jamal Khashoggi. The State Department also says the Saudi government is responsible for executing nonviolent offenders and for torture. President Trump has not punished senior Saudi leaders. Would you?
Yes, and I said it at the time. Khashoggi was in fact murdered and dismembered, and I believe in the order of the Crown Prince. And I would make it very clear, we were not going to, in fact, sell more weapons to them. We were going to, in fact, make them pay the price and make them, in fact, the pariah that they are. There's very little social redeeming value in the present government in Saudi Arabia. And I would also, as pointed out, I would end the subsidies that we have, end the sale of material to the Saudis, who they're going in and murdering children and they're murdering innocent people. And so they have to be held accountable. And with regard to China, we should look, unless we make it clear that we stand for human rights. We should be going to the United Nations seeking condemnation of China, what they're doing with 1 million Uyghurs that are there essentially in concentration camps in the West. We should be vocally speaking out about the violation of the commitment they made to Hong Kong. We have to speak out and speak loudly about violations of human rights.
But now President Biden has angered human rights activists for not directly sanctioning the Crown Prince for Khashoggi's death, although he has announced the U.S. will stop backing the Saudis in Yemen. Whether that actually ends the war is unclear. Philip Zelikow is the White Burkitt Miller Professor of History and J. Wilson Newman Professor of Governance at the University of Virginia. As mentioned, he was the executive director of the 9/11 Commission and is an elected member of the American Academy of Diplomacy. And he has a brand new book out, too, about World War I. The title is The Road Less Traveled. It's about the failed diplomatic efforts that might have ended the war in 1916. Philip Zelikow, welcome to the podcast.
Glad to be with you.
So let's start with what is so important about the U.S. Saudi relationship that would prevent President Biden from directly punishing Mohammed bin Salman?
Well, the United States has to deal with countries around the world, and it usually has to deal with these countries as we find them. Take, for example, the case of Russia. The United States government probably believes that Russia's president is responsible for the assassination or attempted assassination of some political figures in Russia. But the United States then can't say that, well, we can't pretend that Russia doesn't exist or that Russia isn't a country we have to reckon with in our foreign relations. So then you have to figure out, how do you conduct foreign relations with a country in a situation where you think its leader or members of the leadership have done appalling things? This is an old and frankly common problem in the way countries have to relate to other countries in the world. During World War II, we had to fight Germany in concert with Joseph Stalin. A lot of people knew that Stalin was responsible for a lot of bad things in the Soviet Union, arguably the murder of millions of people. So then you treat the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as an important country in the world, and you ask yourself, do we need to have any relations with this country to work on any common problems that we care about? And then you judge how to conduct those relations in light of the fact that you may have very negative conclusions about some of the behavior of the Crown Prince. You asked, what are some of the things the United States has to talk to the Saudis about? One, they have to talk to them about their role in the global oil market. The global oil market is very important, even if the United States itself doesn't rely on Saudi oil or on the global oil market as much. It still relies a lot, and a lot of other countries in the world are very affected by it. So the Saudi role in stabilizing world oil prices remains important for much of the world. Second, Saudi Arabia plays a very large role in the regional balance in a very troubled part of the world, sitting across the Persian Gulf from Iran, about which we also have a lot of concerns, and also adjacent to the United Arab Emirates and Qatar and Kuwait and Iraq, all of them countries that also are important in that region. So if you care about what's going on in that region and you want to have influence in trying to keep that region relatively peaceful, there may be points at which you want to talk to the Saudis about some of their problems. If you want to try to end the terrible, ruinous war in Yemen, you've got to talk to the Saudis about that. If you want to encourage the Arab world to constructively engage in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, you might want to talk to the Saudis about that. The question then is, even if we believe their leader, even if our government believes their leader has done bad things, how do we then conduct those relations amid those beliefs?
And it would be unusual, right, to personally sanction the head of state or effective head of state of a country with which we have diplomatic relations.
And then there's the problem of, if you did personally sanction the Crown Prince, what exactly does that mean?
What does it
accomplish? Does that mean
right?
that the Crown Prince can't travel to the United States? He hasn't traveled to the United States anytime recently, and it's not likely that he will travel to the United States anytime soon. So that's not very meaningful. If it's an effort to then say, well, we will prohibit Saudi investments in the United States or certain movements of Saudi money, that's a very complicated issue. And then we could ask ourselves, do we really want to do that? And does that have a meaningful effect if sovereign Saudi investments then are only confined to Europe or China or the Middle East or Africa or the rest of Asia? Does that really do anything meaningful to Saudi Arabia aside from create an ostentatious symbolism of disapproval?
How might the administration, not that you are its spokesman, of course, you're not, but
I'm certainly not.
How might the administration respond to human rights activists the world over who say, we're talking about the murder here of an innocent person?
And I'm sympathetic to those arguments. So then you just come to the practical question of what do you do since this person is not an American citizen? He's not under the jurisdiction of American justice. What do you do about Vladimir Putin, who is not an American citizen, not under our jurisdiction? Or we could come up with other names, or even the leader of North Korea for that matter, and others. You can make arguments about the Chinese leader, Xi Jinping, and what we think he's responsible for having done. And we could just go down the list. As you work through that list, then you ask yourself, if you believe these people have done wrong, the first thing you can do is be transparent and honest about what we think they have done. And we've done that. The Biden administration, to its credit, made public our intelligence assessment and essentially called them out. That, I think, is the first and important thing that any human rights advocate would want, is if you know people have done terrible things, don't hide it. The first service you can perform is making what you know transparent and then allowing the world to at least understand and assess who they're dealing with here. But then what do you do beyond that practically, since these people aren't under our criminal justice, is a harder question.
It would seem breaking off diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia is out of the question.
Actually, I don't regard that as out of the question. I think it's quite reasonable to consider that.
Interesting.
It's a very serious matter, what the Saudis did. I think it's perfectly appropriate to look very hard at all sorts of options, including breaking off diplomatic relations, and then just make a judgment call about what we think is appropriate under the circumstances.
The administration is going to punish, through visa restrictions, some Saudi figures who are connected to the murder. Do you believe those might be effective, at least at sending a message that the United States doesn't tolerate what happened here?
Well, it certainly sends a message of disapproval. I don't like to use the words sending a message about what the United States does or does not, quote, tolerate, because it makes us sound like we're the imperious ruler of the world, and we are not.
You mentioned the war in Yemen earlier. The new administration says it will no longer support the Saudi war in Yemen, but some critics say that won't actually end the war. What's your view on that?
If the critics have a suggestion to make about an alternative they think will work better, I'd be glad to hear it. There's a general consensus that the war in Yemen has been a disaster. So everyone should be open-minded about what's the best practical answer for that. If the alternative then is to back the Saudi play to destroy the Houthis, okay, then you make that argument. That was the policy we had. If the alternative is to support the Houthis and urge the Saudis to make large concessions to them, either say to partition Yemen into multiple countries or try to negotiate some power sharing arrangement, then go ahead and make that argument and people can evaluate whether or not they think it's practical. Yemen has been partitioned before in the past after earlier civil wars. Those partitions did not work out in those cases, but maybe someone can make an argument as to why they should be tried again. I'm not myself advocating any particular position on how to resolve the Yemen war. I'm not expert enough about it. I just look to those who criticize the Biden administration's approach to put forward what they think is their alternative. The alternative of simply defeating the Houthis in battle and backing the Saudi play hasn't worked out very well.
My next question was going to be, was it wise for the United States to get involved in this to begin with? The Obama, then Trump administrations both backed the Saudis.
And then my honest answer to that, Martin, is I don't know whether it was wise. I don't feel expert enough about the policy analysis that led to the Yemeni choices in either the Obama or the Trump administrations to make the call on whether or not their choices were the right ones.
You've already partly answered my next question in your initial response when we were talking about possible penalties for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. I inferred that you were saying international relations shouldn't be a morality play, and maybe it never has been.
Actually, but let me contradict that a little bit.
Go ahead.
I actually think morality and judgments about whether other leaders or other countries have behaved in ways that comport with our values. I think that actually is important. I think it's quite important in two ways. First, simply as a factual and historical matter, it totally matters. As a historical matter, if you ask the question, in history, do other countries care about the moral quality of the behavior of other leaders? The answer is frequently yes. Did it matter that Hitler was regarded as an outlaw in his domestic behavior during the 1930s? Yes, it mattered. It mattered in popular opinion in Britain, France, the United States. Should it have mattered more? You can have an argument, but for sure it mattered. So one, historically, people do care. Second, there's a question of whether people should care about the moral behavior of other leaders. And my own view actually is, especially in a country like the United States, I believe actually, yes, they should care about the moral behavior of other leaders because the values that other societies represent affect the values that govern relations across the whole world and in many spheres. I remember during World War II, Franklin Roosevelt constantly denounced the enemies of America, not as fascists or Nazis so much as he used to call it international gangsterism. What he was trying to communicate was in plain language every American could understand, is there was gangster behavior and there was appropriate behavior, and America was going to fight against the international gangsters. And that was not a silly argument on Roosevelt's part. So I think historically, the moral quality of other regimes has mattered empirically, and I believe that for Americans particularly, it should matter. That still leaves you with the practical question I raised as to, okay, it matters. Now, what practically should we do, given that, in other words, it was right for our government to have a debate about what to do about MBS. It was right to have that debate, and it's right to have it now. But that doesn't mean that the answer is easy.
And critics of American foreign policy, especially post-World War II foreign policy, would say it matters to the United States as long as it's convenient. So when it comes to the U.S. Saudi relationship, Saudi Arabia is not a democracy, has religious authorities that are fairly strict, has been accused of exporting terrorism. So how do we square our goals to support free and open societies across the world and the advancement of human rights with this relationship with Saudi Arabia, not just now in light of what Mohammed bin Salman is accused of doing, but for the past several decades?
Martin, that's such a terrific question. And it really goes to the heart of a terrible, in a way, eternal dilemma that your listeners just have to step up to in their own ways. Well, really, you have three choices. A, I'm going to have my values, and all my international behavior is going to conform rigidly to my values, no matter what other considerations are involved, no matter what other interests are involved. Values will come first, second, and third. Okay, that's a position. There are a lot of things that flow out of that position. We will have nothing to do with countries we think are bad, and then we'll just deal with whatever world we get as a result. That, in a way, is a form of moral isolationism, but it allows us to feel a sense of moral pride, and we don't have to make any compromises because of other interests. We can only prioritize the values. Or on the other hand, I can say we have no values. We only act according to material interests, as whether we think those are power interests or economic interests or whatever material interests a person seems to think are most important. Between those two poles, you have actually the world in which, frankly, almost every American leader actually lives. You have the silly binary that people pose between idealism and realism. But in fact, in the real life of American foreign policy, and I've been part of that life from time to time over the last 40 years, all the leaders are actually making difficult compromises that trade off, that do take values into account, but also take other interests into account. And the risk of always doing this is, of course, people will accuse you of sometimes being a hypocrite. And sometimes they will be right. That is, in the Cold War, for example, America sometimes did things that betrayed our values and were wrong. If, as a country, you have done things that are wrong, does that mean that now we should have no values because in the past we sometimes ignored them? It's like saying because you ever did anything wrong in your life, you should never try to do anything right. That makes no sense.
I'm reading a book right now about the Cold War and the Eisenhower era and the toppling of the government in Guatemala and then Iran, to your answer. When were the foundations of the current U.S. Saudi relationship formed? 1970s, after the two oil crises?
The famous foundation stone that most people refer back to is the meeting between Franklin Roosevelt and King Ibn Saud in 1945, as Roosevelt was coming back from his Yalta meeting. And symbolically, that's a good starting point. But the relations between the United States and the Saudis for a long time were simply dominated by private oil interests, with the American government taking a very minor role. The Saudis liked this because, and Saudis have explained this to me, most of that part of the world were British protectorates. And the British deal was that we'll defend you, but our government is going to basically take a large ownership position in your oil resources. The Saudis became very anti-British. And what they liked about the Americans is basically the American government kind of got out of the way. The Americans didn't promise to defend Saudi Arabia. It was basically just a matter of dealing with the Texan businessmen. And the Texas businessmen and the Saudis got along great because the Texans wanted to make money. The Saudis were happy to let the Texans make money because the Texans didn't want to take away the Saudi ownership. The Saudis could make money too, and everybody would get rich. The Saudis then began joining some of the oil diplomacy because the Saudis, throughout this period, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the Saudis were very close to Egypt. Kind of the Cairo-Riyadh axis was a very important axis. And the Saudis tended to back the Egyptian plays in opposing and confronting Israel in crisis after crisis, including in the 1970s. What really changed at the end of the 1970s was the United States became alarmed that there were real dangers for a hostile takeover of the Persian Gulf. So what changed at the end of the 1970s? Two things: the revolution in Iran and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Those two events, which occurred in 1978 and 1979, transformed the Arab Middle East. But above all, the Iranian Revolution was the key. It created what are now, I think, 40 years of the wars of religion within the Muslim world. Ever since like 1980, we are seeing a continuing series of wars of religion within the Muslim world, especially between the Shia and Sunni poles. But now increasingly, there are three axes, one centered in Tehran, another centered more in Riyadh and the United Arab Emirates, and a third centered in Turkey, which are historic poles of opposition, with Cairo and the Saudis tending to remain allied on their axis. The United States has been drawn into this because of the perennial hostility between the Iranian Revolution and the United States, which has complex sources. But the United States is not actually at the center of those wars of religion. Those wars of religion are a deep war about how to organize and rule Islamic societies and cope with modernity. The United States is an instrument and a symbol and a player in those conflicts, but it's not at the center of those conflicts. But ever since 1980, the United States has been pulled in, therefore, to trying to maintain stability. Also, since the beginning of the 1980s, we went through a 40-year period of huge reliance on Middle Eastern oil to stabilize and supply the global economy. That reliance now is slowly diminishing. And so the importance of that part of the world is also slowly diminishing. But meanwhile, the Muslim wars of religion go on.
You mentioned Iran. It seems to me one pillar of the U.S. Saudi relationship is bolstering Saudi Arabia to face Iran, whether it's by proxy in Yemen or otherwise. In the Middle East, Iran's influence and power gaining ever since the United States toppled Saddam Hussein in 2003.
Yes, that's right. Iran is one of the key centers of the contest for the Muslim world. This is a contest that runs from Indonesia to Morocco. Iran, for example, exerts significant influence in parts of Iraq and in parts of Syria and in parts of Lebanon. Iran has organized effectively a foreign legion that's been an absolutely crucial combatant in the Syrian civil war, for instance.
A lot of Americans might listen to this conversation and say, what a mess. Americans are, frankly, getting tired of the United States getting bogged down and entangled, so to speak, in these conflicts of Gordian complexity. Just listening to you explain them now.
I understand that. And so I think, therefore, Americans need to make very practical judgments about what matters to us and where we think we can make a constructive difference. I've actually, as a policymaker, found myself in the position of being pulled into cleaning up some of the messes. I mean, I got very involved in the work on the war in Iraq, starting at the beginning of 2005. I had no part at all in the origins of that war. And I find myself at the beginning of 2005 as one of the people called in to try to help fix it when, at the point that we're in a hole that's 8 feet deep. And at least we were trying to stop digging. But it was a very, very hard climb to pull our way out of that. That war is properly a harsh lesson in the limits of American power and influence and how in some ways we can even make things worse. So you go back from that and you learn that lesson, you ask yourself, where can we make a constructive difference? And a good way to answer that question is, instead of starting with America, start with the countries that you're interested in and look at the world from their point of view. Sit in those countries and ask yourself, from my perspective, sitting in this country, what difference does America make to our future? And what could America constructively do here at the margins one way or another? Then, after you answer that question, then ask yourself from the American point of view, is it worth the effort? Do we care? And can we actually do things that are useful? Often it's military instruments are not as useful as people think they are.
I would have to say you are 100% correct about that observation on the utility of military power. Let's talk about the 1980s. And
if I can just interject, Martin, is that one of the lessons that I've learned is that even where military power is useful, it's not the military power people often think of. For instance, the United States had real problems doing anything useful in Iraq with heavyweight military power. The United States, however, played a really quite useful role in the war against ISIS in 2016 and 2017, crossing both the Obama and Trump administrations in knocking back ISIS. We didn't send 100,000 troops to Syria to do that. We did that probably with something less than 10,000 soldiers, because mostly they weren't doing the fighting. What we found is that we could sometimes provide key enablers in intelligence, in medical support, in transportation, in a few vital ways in which we could enable other people to do their own fighting and win their own struggles. We could help them at the margin in shrewd ways, smarter ways that didn't involve America just trying to shoulder everyone aside and take charge.
And by the time the United States had to deal with ISIS, it was, of course, impossible to go back and undo the damage of the 2003 invasion of Iraq. But to play devil's advocate, someone might say to your response, had the United States not foolishly invaded Iraq with, of course, calamitous consequences for the entire region, there would have been no need to fight ISIS later on. ISIS grew out of the chaos that was caused by the U.S. invasion.
And that's a fair argument. And I'm not a defender of the invasion. I wasn't.
Nor were you an architect, as you mentioned.
Nor was I an architect of it. Like the United Nations at the time, I supported trying to reinforce inspections and restore international inspections to Iraq. And I think in retrospect, we would have been well advised to have slowed down and let the international inspectors do their work a while longer. And I think then we might have realized that the WMD concerns were greatly overdrawn. We were beginning to figure that out in early 2003, but we were already moving to invade. You still would have had a problem with Saddam Hussein and Iraq. This had been a long-standing problem, and it was a real problem. But then you compare that problem and how that would have evolved versus the way things have evolved since then. Anyway, people can make their judgments.
And I think these digressions about some of the other players in the Middle East are healthy for this conversation, because it's a reminder. We started off talking about the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, but you just can't silo countries, and even for the purposes of discussion, you do have to look at the whole picture. Here's a subject I wanted to get to that you are an expert on. Your credentials about this are impeccable. The 1980s and the U.S. Saudi partnership, so to speak, to support the jihad in Afghanistan. To what extent were Saudi figures responsible for spreading the Wahhabist sect to the battlefields of Afghanistan? And how did that fuel anti-American sentiment leading up to 9/11? In 3 hours or less? That's a major question, but go ahead.
No, it's actually it's sure it does not take 3 hours.
Okay. It could, but
it could, I suppose. But in a way, the story can be broken down into a couple of simple elements. First is, remember the point I made earlier about the outbreak of the great wars of religion in the Muslim world. And remember that these get going by 1980. Already in 1980, Iran and the Shia are making attacks on the Great Mosque in Mecca itself and challenging Saudi custodianship of the holy places. That's 1980 already. So right from the get-go, by 1980, Saudi religious leaders think they are in a global struggle for the heart of Islam against Iranian religious leaders. So what do? They use their money to evangelize their version of Islam everywhere they can, so that their version of Islam will dominate instead of the Iranian version of Islam, which they regard as heresy. So what's going on then in Afghanistan, also in Pakistan, and everywhere else in the Muslim world, is a heavily funded effort by the Saudi kingdom to proselytize and propagate its version of Islam, which, by the way, is an extremely austere, fundamentalist version of Islam. The Iranians are engaging, of course, in their own efforts in other parts of the Arab world. These Saudi efforts, which are being done for Saudi reasons in their context, have all sorts of negative spillover effects from the United States' point of view. Is they create a lot of funds for madrasas that channel the education of youth in a number of these societies in directions that emphasize religious fundamentalism and were not very constructive even for those societies. This is true in a place like Pakistan as well as Afghanistan. They're funding religious institutions in the United States too, which will become important a little bit in the 9/11 plot. And you're also you're giving money and empowering all sorts of religious evangelists inside the Saudi government, some of whom are pretty fanatical individuals. So the first thing to keep in mind is put the Saudi behavior in the context of the wars of religion in the Muslim world. Now, second level is the United States in relation to that. For Sunni fundamentalists, the United States is kind of the great Satan. Now, that's an Iranian phrase, but there's a version of that in the Sunni extremist movement as well, because the United States stands for secularism, pluralism, globalization in ways. So they see the United States as propping up their own governments, which they hate. So these people are trying to overthrow the government of Egypt. They blame the United States for propping up the government of Egypt. Some of these people will eventually want to overthrow the kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and they see the United States as backing the Saudi government. And they think by attacking the United States, what Osama bin Laden called the far enemy, that attacking the far enemy would help them against their near enemy, which for Osama bin Laden had become the Saudi government. So here's the paradox then, Martin, is you've got people in the Saudi government who were evangelizing this version of Islam at the same time that some of those fanatics form groups that want to overthrow the Saudi government. Both of those things are true.
One of bin Laden's grievances was the Saudi government turned down his offer, such as it was, to expel Saddam Hussein from Kuwait and instead opted for the professional military services of the United States.
Yes, that's right. In 1990 and 1991, that's right. And then Osama became more and more alienated from the kingdom during the early 1990s. And by the middle of the 1990s, he had broken with the kingdom, and he and al-Qaeda were openly advocating for the overthrow of the kingdom and legitimizing the murder of people working for the kingdom. So you've got then this paradox is that the Saudi government is funding religious fanatics, and then some of those fanatics are signing up with bin Laden, who wants to overthrow the Saudi government. And the Saudi government is having trouble figuring out how to confront fanaticism that it is also helping to sponsor, because the religious identity is so important to the identity of the kingdom, including in this religious struggle against the Iranians.
In some of my earlier podcasts, I've asked my guests to clarify what we mean when we say the Russians or the Iranians. In other words, when we talk about Saudi Arabia, do we mean the crown prince, who is an authoritarian ruler, but he is not a totalitarian, and internally he's a reformer or modernizer? Who else wields power and influence in Saudi Arabia? Does Saudi Arabia have an internal politics the average person in America is not aware of?
Absolutely. Saudi Arabia has an internal politics. Most authoritarian societies have internal politics. They're just different than the kind of politics we're used to. Absolutely, there are factions. There are usually factions related to patronage or to different parts of the government, and then they develop alternative theories about what the government should do. So let's look at Mohammed bin Salman for a moment. Mohammed bin Salman comes in a long tradition of people who want to cope with modernization since for the last 200 years, when rulers have faced dilemmas about how do we modernize. One solution to that is the rise of people we could call authoritarian modernizers. That is, I need to get dictatorial control in order to modernize my country, kind of top-down modernizers. I need to yank them into the modern world. Ataturk in Turkey was such an authoritarian top-down modernizer. In some ways, MBS, I think probably in some ways, draws some inspiration from Ataturk. I need to limit religious power in my society. I need to open it up in certain ways, but not others. I need to make Saudi Arabia a much more modern country from a professional and business point of view, and therefore I need to do certain things. But I need a firm dictatorial hand to do all this. I need to crush corruption, because these are people who are out for their private interests, and I need to make it clear that I'm the power, but I'm going to wield that power to modernize my country in these ways. That's the way he thinks of himself and his mission. And Khashoggi, by opposing his dictatorship and by opposing his authoritarian power, he's quite ruthless in dealing with that, as he's ruthless in dealing with other people he doesn't like in society. And so there have been people in the society who dislike this. Now, who dislikes it? Who's opposed to him? Of course, a lot of people who are opposed to him who are against the modernity. The older religious zealots are very opposed to MBS because he's been limiting their power. He's got support among younger people who like the additional modernity and are willing to tolerate the dictatorship. But then he's also opposed by people who have a more liberal vision for Saudi society. So he's opposed from conservatives in society who hate the modernizing and hate the opening. He's opposed by liberals who hate the dictatorship. But he's got an important center of support from people in the business, professional community, and the young who like the fact that he's bringing the society forward, even if he's yanking it forward with authoritarian means. They're okay with that.
So in closing this discussion about the U.S. Saudi relationship, maybe the most important question is, how does the United States balance its sense of what is practical with its values?
I'm afraid the hard answer is that it's not easy. We would like that to be clear and simple and have a nice binary in which we knew which answers were always right and which ones were always wrong, and where we could never be accused of hypocrisy. I think real life is just not that simple, at least in international politics and in the world. We have to confront the world as we find it and try to help protect the American people from pandemics or climate change and a lot of other concerns by working with other people who we may not like for a lot of reasons. And that's just a challenge for us. And the Saudi case that you raise is an excellent, clear illustration of the dilemma you drew out with your question.
Philip Zelikow, you've given us a lot to think about today. Thanks for being here. And good luck with your new book, The Road Less Traveled, about diplomacy during World War I. On the next episode of History as It Happens.
She said, black people aren't Republicans. You're a sellout to your race and you're an Uncle Tom. So yes, I have dealt with this.
Maxine Waters called you to your face an Uncle Tom.
And a sellout to my race.
Where are the black Republicans? The time when African Americans overwhelmingly voted for the GOP is not ancient history. We'll take a look at the dramatic shift in black voting from FDR to present next when we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.